me start the most recent one. This is the most recent one. This is the book called The Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, which she edited with Jacob Bay. But she's also the author of No Citizen Left Behind and of The Demands of Liberal Education. Those are great books. I've only read the first one, but I'll soon read the second one. And she's going to talk to us about the title of the presentation, Theorizing Educational Justice, which most of you read, but I should take just a few seconds to say that this is a very innovative, very ambitious project, and I think it's something very original that we should be very happy that we get to discuss here. And so, without further ado, I'll let you present everything.
Great, thank you. I don't want to put you on the spot. It will just help me to know how much detail to go into, how long to talk, and how quickly or slowly to talk. Can you let me know if you've already read the paper? Can you just raise your hand? Oh, virtually all of you. Okay, so that's really helpful. And then, can you also let me know, can you raise your hand if you feel perfectly comfortable with me talking in English at this speed? Great, okay, thank you, that's very helpful. All right, so in that case, I think what I will do is, since there are a few of you who have not read the paper, I will sort of choose a midway point. I will do more than just remind you of the main ideas, but I will do less than present the entire paper, because there's no reason for you to listen to something you've already read. As one said, so this book, The Dilemmas of Educational Ethics, is a part of a sort of big project that I'm sort of trying to head up. And this paper arises in the context of that larger project. So just as a brief bit, this is not in the paper, but it may sort of help you orient, sort of understand sort of why and how I'm thinking about these issues. I did a doctorate in political theory right out of university, so I went from University of London my doctorate, and I wrote about education and ended up being the demands of liberal education. And then I became a school teacher for 8 years, and I taught in 2 urban school systems in the United States, in the Atlanta Public Schools and in the Boston Public Schools. And when I was teaching, I was coming with all of these ideas as a philosopher, as a political theorist, all these ideals and principles I had written in my dissertation and in my first book about, say, how schools should help children develop the capacity for autonomy, the ability to, sort of decide on how they wanted to lead their lives, change those decisions, say, if they started to question what their parents had taught them, what their teachers had taught them, or whatever, and then actually live out those lives that they wanted to live, assuming that they were, decent ones, not totally illegal, right, etc. And then when I was teaching in the Atlanta Public Schools, in a school that was mostly serving low-income students, all of whom were African American, I started trying. It was the first time I had to think carefully about, okay, what does it mean to say help children attain autonomy in this context as opposed to in another context? For example, how much is it just about the individual development of individual students and helping them achieve the kind of cognitive capacities and social emotional learning and whatever, so that they can choose a good life for themselves and lead it? And how much of it is actually taking account of the structural and institutional context in which they live? For example, the existence of structural and institutional racism, right? And so it was thinking about those issues that led me to sort of the second part of the work that ended up in this book, No Citizen Left Behind, thinking about the ways in which we have to think about individuals in context and how even if, say, ultimately maybe your concern is an individual child, you have to think about the institutional context in which they're living, and so I ended up making an argument about how we need to strive to empower students civically. That especially if you are a member of a historically marginalized group whose opportunities are restricted in some ways because of transform society, because ultimately it's only through the transformation of society that then they'll be able to lead, you know, good lives that they want to lead, right? So one of the things that I found quite depressing was that my students in both Atlanta and in Boston, basically the message to them was, well, if you get a good education, then you can escape your neighborhood, you can escape where you live and like go somewhere else. And that's a tragic, I mean, it's a horrible, horrible, horrible sort of choice or opportunity, right, to tell somebody is you have, if you do right, you can leave behind your family and friends who love you, and leave behind the place that you care about, and go and then raise your children in safety and find a good job somewhere else, right? That's just not what, say, I ask of my children, and it's not what any child should be faced with. So that was the idea behind sort of thinking about civic education. But civic education as a sort of tool for social transformation and tool for also then individual empowerment is sort of one piece of this much broader set of dilemmas that I think educators and educational policymakers face, which is so you can know, let's say, what your aim is. You know, in my case, I knew that my aim was to help my students develop autonomy. But how you do that in a context is a sort of separate, really challenging question, right? So, you know, what it means, how much I should have, so I spent a lot of time trying to wrestle with this. How should I, you know, how much of it should be teaching my students, say, how to navigate in a white middle-class culture that, you know, tended to control a lot of the political and economic power, right? But how do I think about, say, teaching them that at the cost of teaching them, inadvertently teaching them, but nonetheless potentially teaching my students that their own sort of cultural resources were less valued or less valuable. Like, that was not something I wanted to do. And so that was a very pragmatic problem that I faced as a teacher, is how do I help my children, my students, attain autonomy, attain freedom, develop the ability to be self-directing in their lives, when I have this sort of pragmatic challenge at hand of the fact that they're living in a racist society that disvalues part of what they have to bring to the table. And that's not the only kind of problem where sort of the pragmatic choices that we face raise questions about then how you realize the values that you hold and the aims that you hold. And of course, that is a very stylized example of if we have one clear value, then how do we achieve it? But then the question is, what if you have multiple values, right? And what if those multiple values in a particular situation end up coming into conflict with one another, right? And then how do you make judgments? So part of what had really sort of both troubled me and fascinated me during my years as a school teacher was day after day after day being confronted by these ethical dilemmas of how do I realize values and principles in practice, right? And so, and right now I have the feeling, this is true in the United States, and my sense is that it's also sort of true in the global, sort of neoliberal global conversations about education. And from talking to one yesterday, and a little bit of one just now, I have the sense that it also may be at least somewhat true here in Mexico that right now ethics, sort of ethical claims are used to attack others, to attack the other side, right? But they are not really seen, they're not used to deliberate. They're not seen as being sort of legitimate objects of deliberation where people might authentically come from different sides of an issue. So, for example, I know that the question of teacher evaluations is a big issue here. And so certainly when teacher evaluations are discussed in the United States, there will be very strong, firm claims that say if you're in favor, by those who are in favor of higher stakes teacher evaluations, well, we care about all children, right? We care about quality and we care about excellence, and by implication, and you guys don't, right? You just are captured by the teachers' unions, you're captured by corruption, whatever. And then on the other side, those who are opposed to, say, the expansion of high stakes teacher evaluations will also use very ethical language and very moral language, right? We care about care, we care about context, we care about, say, teaching as a profession and craft knowledge and all sorts of things, and by implication you don't, right? You don't actually care about the children. Those of you who are in favor of high stakes teacher evaluation, you think about children as widgets, right? And that's probably not true either, right? But because people sort of take these very strong stances about what ethics obviously sort of requires you to do, then all you can do is sort of claim that the other side is immoral or unethical, right? And what I'm interested in is, in fact, enabling us to have open, transparent, public conversations about ethical dilemmas, about the hard cases which happen all the time in education policy and practice, where, yes, you can believe in social justice, but no, that doesn't tell me what you therefore think about, say, what you should do about school dropouts, or what you should do about teacher training, or what you should do about private versus public schools. Like, I don't know. That's great that you believe in social justice, but we have to go further, right? Yes, I know that you believe in equality of educational opportunity, but no, that doesn't tell me what you therefore think about gifted and talented education, right? I don't know. Maybe, right? And so, so that's what I'm interested in doing, and in sort of moving from ethical claims as an object of, as a sort of means of attack, to actually an object of conversation. And then one other sort of background piece I'll give is that what worries me, and for those of you who read the paper, what at least those of you who have any political theory training may have picked up on that I have in the background, is that those who are interested in talking directly about ethical and political sort of dilemmas in education tend to fall back on very general political theories. So the only slightly explicit person I'm sort of in argument with here in this paper is John Rawls and the set of political theorists who come out of a Rawlsian tradition, who are in some ways most political theorists in the Anglo-American tradition over the last few decades. Too often, I think, so if part of the problem is that educators and policymakers tend to, say, take whatever policy they believe in or whatever practice they believe in, and then say, well, my policy or practice is the only one you can believe in if you're ethical, right? And the other side just, doesn't care, or they're captured by corporations, or they're captured by unions, or whatever. Philosophers, I think, take the sort of opposite, they do the opposite thing that's wrong, which is that they say, okay, I have an ethical theory here, I have a political theory about values and principles, and now I can just apply it to a question of educational policy and practice from my armchair, and I can sort of say what we should do. And without any understanding of the nuances of the context, they often know nothing about children, about teachers, about educational systems, whatever. But also, they're not thinking about what it means to talk about, say, children, right? And they just sort of apply these theories that have been developed not only by adults, but about adults, for adults. And then they just sort of apply them willy-nilly to educational questions. And I think that when they do that, they tend to get it wrong as well. And so this sort of project is an attempt to bring together the insights of policymakers and practitioners with the insights of philosophers and theorists and the insights of social scientists together to try to grapple with sort of issues of educational ethics, saying if we do this sort of in concert with one another, then we are likely to think about the correct problems rather than problems that, say, only a philosopher would think about in her armchair, but not actually anybody in the ground. To think about them in a way that's informed by, say, empirical research, but where we know that empirical research isn't like the be-all and end-all, right? So it's really, really important. But empirical research also is implicitly or explicitly grounded in certain values and presuppositions, right? There are things that you choose to look at and things you choose not to look at. We all do that, right? I mean, we all have to make choices, but those choices also are grounded in at least implicit assumptions about what really matters, and what we should foreground and what's background. And with insights from people who actually do this work on the ground. The idea is that we'll do that better. But even with that vision, my sense is, and this is what this paper is about in a certain way, it can't be that we just bring people to the table with their ideas already fixed, right? And so this paper, in a way, is in some ways talking to philosophers and theorists the most, although I know that a few of you around the table are political theorists, say, as your primary identity. But it's a way of saying, if we want to think about these ethical questions seriously, we can't just say take these theories that are by adults, for adults, about adults, right, and apply them directly to education. And that one of the best ways to sort of think about what we should be doing instead, and this is a kind of model for how I think we should do this work, is to think about a concrete case, right, and to start from a concrete case. Because if we start from a concrete case, that will very quickly force us to, sort of challenge our background assumptions about what to take as given and what actually we need to wrestle with. So the paper starts, with this case about this girl we call Kate. And for those of you who have not read the paper, I'll just review it really quickly. So she is 8 years old. She goes to a fairly wealthy public school. It's a suburban school outside of Philadelphia. And she was doing great, in her first few years of schooling in kindergarten and first grade. And then things started to go somewhat wrong. She started having outbursts. She would start screeching. She would start playing on the table in the middle of class and couldn't actually hear what the other kids were saying. And that became more and more problematic, right? Because it's very hard to learn when this is going on. So ultimately, yeah, right. So ultimately, for a while, she was pulled out into a special class. She got somewhat better over time. She was then mainstreamed back into her class, a third grade class. She had an aide for a while, but things were going better, so she no longer has an aide who follows her around during the day. But she still does have outbursts sometimes. She saw a psychiatrist who gave a diagnosis that was pretty unclear. Basically, this is a girl for whom things should be going right and they're not, so I don't know, we're going to kind of make a diagnosis. This is what he came up with. Non-specific opposition defiance disorder. In this school, there's a room called the think room, which is kind of like an isolation cell. A prison, yeah, it has some comfy beanbags, so it's not so prison-like, but yeah, and the room is really controversial in the district. In fact, some parents have gotten together with some local lawyers, in fact, to challenge the think room and to try to get rid of it altogether. But Kate's parents and Kate herself actually appreciate this room because it's a place she can go when she has an outburst and kind of calm down. And sometimes she falls asleep in there. Other times she just sort of screams and throws things until she calms down. And she often spends the rest of the day in there, but sometimes she's able to come back to the classroom. So, so then the case like focuses in on a particular day when she comes to school. Late, she's had a really rough morning, but she really wants to come to learn about rocks because she loves rocks, and they're studying rocks and their origins. And so she's put in a group. Like she gets there late, and so the teacher sort of just puts her in a group with two boys, Philip and Frank. Right? And Philip is very confident and very high achieving. He wants to be a world famous inventor when he grows up. Frank has these problems with reading, and he's very self-conscious, and he tends to sort of withdraw and stop, like when he feels as if the challenge is getting too great for him. And so the teacher really has to work with him on like staying engaged and continuing to learn. And there's one other feature that's important in this case you may remember. So Philip's father, along with some of the other parents, had gone to the head of the school principal, the previous week, to complain about Kate, to say that she was creating an unsafe classroom atmosphere that was making the other kids scared and that was preventing kids from learning. And so the principal had told the teacher, look, if Kate risks having an outburst, pull her out of the classroom before she has the outburst. That way she can feel good that she hasn't disrupted class, and we can feel good that class wasn't disrupted, and these parents aren't going to take it to the superintendent, right? Or, maybe a problem. And the teacher is opposed to this because she believes in inclusion and she believes in accommodating, all sorts of differences, right? So Kate and Philip and Frank are working in this group, classifying rocks. It's going well, and then Frank and Philip start having this argument, right? Is the rock sedimentary or is it metamorphic? And they get more and more and more concerned about it, right? And Kate clearly gets more and more agitated, and she backs away. So initially, it's not so bad because she's simply removing herself. But Miss Brown can tell that she's getting really in trouble, right? And Miss Brown is over in the other side of the classroom helping a group that has no clue about rock classification, right? They're looking at color, they're looking at size, they're looking at all sorts of stuff that is not relevant to whether it's sedimentary, metamorphic, or igneous. And so she's trying to help them gain basic understanding of scientific classification, but she can see what's going on across the room. So she comes over, tries to say, well, how about Kate, referee this and decide. And the boys are like, no. And interestingly and unusually, right, Frank is, no, I know, I got this right, which is so unusual for him because usually he would pull out of something like this. And so the teacher doesn't want to stop his engagement, but she can also tell that Kate is about to explode, right? She knows that she's under orders to remove Kate before she explodes. And on the other hand, Kate has put so much effort to come in to study rocks, right? And so she's sort of faced with this question of what should she do. And although this is a very concrete, like one teacher in a classroom, right, kind of case, I'm hoping that, say, as you read the paper and as I sort of do this mid-level review of the paper, you can see how it raises questions that are not just inside the classroom, right? But you can also think about the questions from the perspective of this, from the school level, from a district level, a state level, a federal level. Right? These questions that arise about which children should we pay attention to, how should we decide whose needs should take precedence and when and how do we structure educational opportunities so that we get that right mix, right? Including sometimes we're going to have to sacrifice somebody, right? It's not always that every classroom is going to be perfect and every child is going to be perfect. It's not the case that always every school or every district or every state is going to be perfect, right? There are challenges, and part of the reason that I start with this case is because the challenges in here are really everyday challenges. Kate is a little bit extreme, right? She's gone to the psychiatrist, she has these problems, but kids are disruptive, they're irrational, and so forth all the time. And they have very different needs all the time. And so this question about, okay, how do we make decisions about what we owe to kids, what we owe potentially to their parents, right? That's a question but in a way that's ethical, right? These are the kinds of questions that I think educators and educational policymakers are also, should be wrestling with on a daily basis, often are wrestling with on a daily basis, but without any means to talk with others about them, because it's embarrassing, right? You don't want to admit that you don't know, like, whom you should be serving and how. You don't want to, sort of admit to having made an immoral or an unethical choice, right? Having, say, committed an injustice against a student or a group of students. And or if you do talk to others, then it goes back to sort of ethics as exhortation, right? Where it's like, well, if you believe in equity, then X, right? And I think here you can believe in equity and still not really know. So what I want to do is I'll sort of, talk you somewhat through, sort of briefly-ish, through the paper, and the kinds of questions that I think we need to think about if we're trying to develop a theory of educational justice. Right, and so we have this outline for anybody who needs it. So there are, and one of the things that I want to emphasize, which I've sort of implied, is that these are the kinds of questions that come up anywhere, even in, right, a well-resourced place, right? There's no lack of money here for the school, for the students, etc. There's no lack of goodwill, in fact, basically on everybody's part. This is what Rawls would call a well-ordered society, and yet still these kinds of questions come up. And so that's another reason that I chose this case, that it's somewhat pure in that it's not, it is not, say, infected by, say, questions of historical racism or injustice or other things, right? We're not dealing with that. What we're dealing with is kids being kids, parents being parents, teachers and administrators being teachers and administrators, having to figure out how to sort of navigate this set of questions about who is owed what and why and how, which are the basic questions about justice. So to start with sort of section 2.1, I've already said that, I think Kate is a good example because although she is extreme, all children are irrational and unreasonable at various times. And we see this not only with Kate, but also with, say, Frank, who has strong educational needs. He actually has to learn how to read well, and he gets much better at decoding text in 3rd grade. He's 8 years old. And yet, whose reaction when he feels too challenged is to withdraw, right, and stop engaging, which is exactly the opposite of what will actually help him develop reading skills, right? So in some ways, that's unreasonable, but totally explicable, right? In some way, I mean, we are sorry about it, but it's not that we think that Frank is some wacko child who just shouldn't be considered, right? I mean, he's a normal kid who should be an object or a subject of educational justice, right? Philip is another case in ways of being unreasonable, in that he can tell that Kate is starting to get upset. He hates it when Kate disrupts class, right? He's complained to his father about it. His father went to the principal and said, you better not make me take this to the superintendent. And nonetheless, he doesn't stop this argument, right? He wants to keep arguing with Frank about this rock. That's also in some ways unreasonable, but also perfectly reasonable for an 8-year-old to do, right? So lots of kids are kind of unreasonable and even irrational. And obviously, it would be tons easier for Mrs. Brown, the teacher, to decide what to do in this case if she could get all the kids to be reasonable. If she could get Kate to realize this is not a threatening fight, this is an argument about how to classify rocks, exactly what you're excited about, right? If she could get Frank, if they stopped, say this, because Kate isn't able to handle the stress, if she had confidence that Frank would engage as enthusiastically next time, if she could get Philip to recognize this is causing Kate trouble, why don't you stop, back off, you don't actually have to pursue this argument, then Miss Brown would have it easy, right? There wouldn't be a dilemma. But that's not how classrooms, schools, districts work, right? And that's not how kids work. They are all sort of perfectly normally being kids. So one thing I think that we have to just take as a given, if we're trying to think about what does educational justice mean, is that the subjects of educational justice, namely children, are going to be unreasonable and irrational, at least some of the time. And that may not sound particularly profound, especially if you're, say, not a political theorist, but that is profoundly different from, say, the premise of theories of justice, particularly Rawlsian theories of justice, but also actually many other theories of justice, that assume that basically everybody is rational and reasonable. And in an educational context, clearly that's just, you can't say that. Second of all, and related to that, and so we're now in section 2.2, I say that therefore, you can't just look at questions of distributive justice, of what you distribute to kids, say what you give them in terms of educational resources, but you also have to think about corrective justice, about rewards and punishments. And you have to do this at the same time. And that's because when we're educating kids, not only are they sometimes unreasonable and irrational, but we're also trying to help them become more reasonable and more rational, right? We are trying to educate them to become people who can control their emotions, control their behaviors, right? And who have sort of a broader understanding of the world. And so as one of the weird things about, again, theories of justice by adults, for adults, about adults, is that they've historically taken this very separate turn. So you have theories of distributive justice, which are about how do we, say, distribute educational about education, how do we distribute educational resources, teachers, or money, or schools, or test scores, or whatever it is that they care about. And then separately, you have theories of corrective justice, of punishment and reward, usually about adults, but when it's about kids, there are, say maybe theories about restorative justice, other things like that. But my argument is if we're actually thinking about justice, we have to put those things together. We can't think about them separately, right? Because any choice that you make about one affects the other. So if you withdraw Kate from the classroom, I'll say, so I make a claim in two ways. One is on a theoretical level, we actually have to clarify what's a distributive question and what's a corrective question, right? And I have no opinion about how we should do it, but the distributive question, clearly, presumably, teaching about scientific classification is a distributive question that's giving kids some cognitive understanding. How about teaching them how to work in groups? That may be a distributive question, right? We might be teaching them sort of some soft skills or social emotional learning, or maybe it's a corrective question, and that we're teaching them sort of how to control themselves when other kids are really annoying in that group, right? Or how, I don't know. And I don't have a stance on this. It could be that it's all distributive. It's clearly not all corrective, right? Teaching somebody how to multiply fractions is not corrective justice. That's really distributive justice. It's fine with me if it's all distributive justice. It's fine with me if we say, well, teaching people basically how to behave with others is corrective justice, right? We punish, we reward for, we punish you if you steal something from somebody else, or if you cause an explosion in the classroom, if you hit or kick somebody. It's fine with me if we consider that corrective justice. But anyway, we have to clarify how they're related theoretically. And then empirically, clearly, whatever sort of theoretical relationship we've come up with, they are very much related. So if you decide to, if say Mrs. Brown decides to withdraw Kate from the classroom preemptively, then she is not only maybe correcting Kate, saying to her, okay, I can see that you're getting out of, you risk getting out of control. Let's take you to the think rooms where you can calm down before it gets too bad, right? And this is sort of part of my teaching you how to be a good person in a group, right? But she's also withdrawing educational resources from Kate, because she's not going to send Kate to the think room when she's really agitated with a box of rocks, right? That would be a really bad choice. And so Kate is not going to learn that. And also, Philip and Frank point, are not going to learn how to actually accommodate themselves to somebody who has social emotional needs that are different from theirs, right? So that also is something where they are losing some learning. Of course, if she leaves Kate in the classroom and Kate explodes, right, the whole class is going to stop learning about scientific classification for at least a while, right? So that's why I think they're related, and we have to think about them together. In section 3, I then say, okay, so we have distributive concerns, we have corrective concerns, we realize kids are irrational and unreasonable to some degree. These are sort of things that we have to think about in the theory of justice. And now we also have to realize that even in the best situation, therefore, we are working in kind of compromised circumstances where we have to take into account sort of historical trajectory. So this is not about historical injustice necessarily, but we have to recognize that that enacting educational justice at any one time is in response to a kind of imperfect system, where we need to behave in a way that people recognize as just now, but which sets them up for a different way of interacting with each other, and a different vision of justice in the future. And this is a little complicated, so I'm just going to read this part so I make sure that I say it, right? You have kids who have incompletely developed cognitive and emotional capacities. And so we therefore often encourage them to adopt rules that are not on their face absolutely defensible, right? We say it's never okay to hurt someone. Well, that's false, right? Sometimes it is okay to hurt someone in conditions of war, if somebody is actually self-defense, right? But we don't go into that, right, with an 8-year-old, right? We say it's never okay to hurt somebody. You may not hit or kick or whatever, right? And that's because that's what they are ready for, right, developmentally. That's the right thing to teach them. But we want to teach them that at this time in a way that will lead them to then be ready to adopt a more nuanced understanding, kind of justice in our relationship with one another later in time. So it's not a stable system. This is again where I'm reacting against Rawls, against John Rawls, who presupposes that if you have a just system, it's going to be stable and kind of self-reinforcing. People will experience the justice of the system, of the institutions. They'll buy into it because they see them as just. So then they'll behave in ways that keep it just, and it's like this virtuous circle, right? And that's great in theory, but clearly in educational context, you don't have that stable system because you have kids who are developmentally at one place on a trajectory, and so you don't want them always thinking it's never okay to hurt someone, but you want them at this point to be thinking that. So instead of a stable system providing an exemplar that all are moved to embrace and maintain, I say that just educational institutions will constitute a dynamic system, a system that moves and changes, intentionally accommodating itself to imperfection, but with the goal of moving toward a more inspiring ideal. And I say it's sort of educational justice is both being and becoming, bootstrapping itself from an imperfect present to the more perfectly imagined future. And so I think of this a bit as a form of transitional justice. I was